This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Events and Exhibitions Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to hear from renowned economist Ross Garnaut AC as he discusses his new book, Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession. Following his presentation, Ross will be joined on stage by author and journalist Tori Shepherd to further discuss how this most recent global crisis offers Australia the opportunity to reset its economy and build a successful future. I would like to thank publisher Black Ink and Pitch Projects for their work in making sure this event came to fruition. And I have to say, it's quite a miracle that we have Ross in the venue tonight. It was a touch and go for a while, but thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. In 2008, Ross produced the Garnaut Climate Change Review for the Australian Government, a review that examined the impact of climate change on the Australian economy and provided potential medium-term to long-term policies to improve Australia's prospects for sustainable prosperity. In addition to his distinguished academic career, Ross Garnaut has also had long-standing and successful roles as policy advisor and diplomat. He was the principal economic advisor to the late Honourable Bob Hawke and subsequently served as the Australian ambassador to China from 85 to 88. Ross is the author of numerous publications on international economics, public finance and economic development, particularly in relation to East Asia and the Southwest Pacific. In 2009, Ross was actually here with us presenting the 12th annual Hawke Lecture, Climate Change, the Public Interest and Private Interests in Australian Policy. So it is now my great pleasure to welcome back to the Hawke Centre, Ross Garnaut. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacinta. Great to be in a centre named after my old boss. We had some good times together and he very much appreciated the work done at the Hawke Centre at the University of South Australia, always supported it very strongly, and I was very glad a decade ago to give one of the Hawke orations. My new book, Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession, in some ways builds on my last book before the recession, Superpower, Australia's Low Carbon Opportunity. That came out at the end of 2019 when we didn't know much about COVID-19, didn't know anything about it. In Superpower, I looked at what had happened since my big review in 2007, 2008, for all of the governments of Australia, the federal government, the state governments, and the two territories. It was commissioned by all of them. Back then, I had very strong support from Australia's best scientists in interacting as well with people in the field all over the world. Did some very detailed economic modelling, and we came to the conclusion that it would be actually quite costly for Australia to play its full part in a global effort to deal with climate change, but the costs of not dealing with climate change were a good deal greater, so that it was in our national interest to get on with the job despite the short-term costs. In the review of what had happened since 2008 that I presented in the book Superpower, the biggest change over 11 years had been a quite dramatic cost reduction in the costs of dealing with the problem. And the reductions in costs were especially low for Australia because we were endowed with extraordinarily rich resources for producing energy without carbon emissions, extraordinarily rich combinations of solar and wind resources in particular. That meant that as the world moved towards zero emissions, then we would have big economic advantages, competitive advantages. If we played our cards right, we would have lower energy costs than the rest of the world, and this would be quite a big economic advantage for us. It would support new industries that had not been competitive before. The other biggest advantage that Australia had was that we've got far more land per head of population than other developed countries, about 10 times as much as other developed countries on average, much more than 10 times as much as the average for developing countries. Also longer coasts per head of population, so we had much larger opportunities for capturing carbon in our soils, by growing plants, much larger opportunities for growing biomass as a base for industrial activities. And we'll be drawing a lot of industrial raw materials, feedstocks for plastics and petrochemicals in the zero emissions world economy. The things that we today make out of coal and oil and gas, all of the plastics, for example, will have to be made from biomass, chemically very similar, just that the biomass has been sitting in the earth for a few million or a few hundred of millions of years in the case of coal. Biomass will be scarce and valuable, and countries which have it in relative abundance will have advantages in a whole range of industries. And with the whole world moving towards zero emissions, we would have very large new industrial advantages. And there are advantages that we don't have in the fossil energy economy. We not only have the richest renewable energy resources in the developed world per person, and the biggest opportunities for capturing carbon in the landscape per person in the developed world. We also have, of course, the richest coal and gas resources. But the rich coal and gas resources did not give us sustainable advantages in domestic industry. The reason for that is that these raw materials, coal for steel making or coal for energy, gas for plastics or for energy, are internationally tradable, and the costs of using Australian coal in Shanghai or Kobe are not very different from the costs of using them around Australia. In fact, Australia is the source of the largest quantities of the best metallurgical coal for making steel, but it costs more to use Australian metallurgical coal in Whyalla than it does in Kobe in Japan or Shanghai in China. The international transport costs are relatively low, only 5 or 6% of the value of the metallurgical coal, and certainly no cheaper, sometimes more expensive moving them around Australia. So the fact that we had very rich coal resources did not give us an advantage in industry. Similarly with gas, very rich natural gas resources and unconventional gas resources from coal seam per head of population compared with other developed countries. For a while, this did give us an industrial advantage before we were exporting gas, when we had the very large Bass Strait fields discovered in the late 60s, added to those, the Cooper Basin, southwest Queensland. We did have a surplus of gas, and so for a while we had very low gas prices, and that did support a lot of industry in Melbourne and Geelong, Adelaide in particular, also to some extent Brisbane, Sydney. But we lost that advantage when we developed a very large export industry for gas from Gladstone. The domestic price rose to the international price, and industries based on local gas had no international advantage. That's the situation we're in now. But that will be different with our advantage with renewable energy and carbon in the landscape, because these products are not so easily transportable internationally. You can take Australian renewable energy to Asia. In fact, there's a very large project being designed in the Northern Territory to do exactly that, to a submarine cable from Darwin to Singapore, but it'll be very expensive. So the cost of the power in Singapore will be several times as high as the cost in Darwin. So you're not going to take Australian electricity to Singapore to produce industrial products. It'll be much cheaper to do it here. Similarly, you can convert renewable energy into hydrogen and transport the hydrogen, but that's also very expensive to transport. You use about half of the energy content of hydrogen in the compression of the hydrogen, the liquefaction, getting it down cold enough to liquefy. You have to take it almost to absolute zero, and so if you lose half the energy there, and it's very expensive to transport. That's hydrogen, the smallest molecule. It seeps out between the molecules of steel. So you've got to build a ship out of special materials, much more expensive than a ship to carry LNG. So you will be able to transport hydrogen and products made from hydrogen to Japan or China or Korea or India or Germany, but it'll be very much more expensive there. A lot of our current coal and gas exports go to process Australian raw materials in other countries. Australia is the main source of many of the most important industrial minerals. Australia is by far the world's main source of iron ore, iron oxide. China produces half the world's steel. 60% of China's iron ore imports are drawn from Australia. Australia is by far the world's biggest producer and exporter of aluminium ore from bauxite used in aluminium production. The same is true of a wide range of minerals. And so we're going to have a very large opportunity for processing these here in Australia in the zero emissions world economy. So in Superpower, I pointed out that what had changed between 2008 and 2019 was that what we'd seen as a big cost was actually not going to be such a large short-term cost, and if we embrace the opportunity, there were very large economic advantages for Australia. Well, since then we've had the pandemic, and the new book traces the effect of that on the economy and talks about how we get out of the recession that's been created by the pandemic. Yesterday we had very healthy figures for economic growth in the December quarter, 3.1%, and that's a very good thing. The second half of last year showed strong economic growth, but that still doesn't take us back up to where we were at the beginning of the year. We had such strong economic growth in the second half of the year for two reasons. One is that we are one of the countries, and the others are all in our region, the Western Pacific region, that dealt effectively early on with the pandemic, we can move out of it into return to economic growth more easily, more quickly, because we've dealt with the problem. Europe, UK, the US can't get back into economic growth until they've dealt with the problem. The second reason is that in the early stages of the pandemic, back in March, our government embarked on by far the biggest increase in government expenditure in a short period of time that we've ever had. We ended up adding about 15% of GDP, and a huge increase in government debt-funded government expenditure, and that gave us a very good boost through the second half of that year, and that continues some momentum into the new year. Well, the point I make in the book is that you won't get sustainable growth of incomes if it all comes from just boosting up domestic demand in the way that we did. It was a thoroughly good thing that we gave that big boost, JobKeeper, JobSeeker. It was necessary to hold up the economy. It was the right response. The fact that it was so quick and so good was a very good thing. But that is not the foundation for sustainable growth. If growth is to be sustainable, we've got to support that growth in demand, domestic demand, by an expansion of investment and output in what I call the trade-exposed industries. And for them, it's not government expenditure, it's competitiveness that will affect how well we do. So I talk in the book a fair bit about what we can do to improve the competitiveness of Australian industry, and I focus on three things in particular. One is getting the balance right between fiscal policy, expanding government expenditure, and monetary policy, keeping interest rates low and expanding money supply. And I point out that we haven't done very well with this over the past 7 or 8 years. The second thing that I suggest is that we undertake a major reform of corporate income tax so that we shift the base of the corporate tax from conventional accounting definitions of profit to cash flow, so that a company undertaking very large capital expenditure can immediately deduct capital expenditure from income from tax purposes, and that will greatly favour businesses that are doing a lot of innovating, investing, taking risks and expanding. I would also deny deductions for payment of interest and other financing costs. The combination of those things would shift the tax burden away from the companies that are investing and innovating towards the companies that are sitting on their laurels. And the third thing that we have to do to get growth in our trade-exposed industries, the export industries, is to take advantage of our low-carbon opportunity. For us to have sustainable growth, we're going to have a lot of investment in the trade-exposed industries, in the export industries. But at first sight, conditions are not very congenial for that. We face some pretty big headwinds. One of the headwinds is the rest of the world's actions on climate change. 22% of our exports are coal and gas. Coal exports will be declining. Already there's quite rapid decline in coal use in Europe and North America. China, accounting for about half the world's coal use, was reducing its use of coal for several years. It clicked up a bit during the trade wars with Trump's America, but it started to fall again. I think we will see big measures announced in China's 14th five-year plan later this month to that effect. So there's not going to be growth anyway in the fossil energy exports that have been so important. There'll be some decline. Also headwinds from problems in our trade relations with China. China, the main source of dynamism in our exports in the last decade, and now that's run into a brick wall. China's as big an export market as the next 9 countries put together. If you include Hong Kong in the China side, and China column and not the rest of the world column, it's as big as the next 11 countries put together. And so it's quite a headwind for us to have a trade problems with China that we've got at the moment. A third headwind is that the pandemic, together with the challenges with China, has put into reverse what had been our strongest export growth through the half dozen years leading up to the pandemic. And these were exports of services, education services and tourism. Education had become our third largest export industry. Well, that's got, of course, been run into its own brick wall with the pandemic restrictions, and it will take quite a while to rebuild that. And I point out in the book that the one big constraint on rebuilding that is the damage that's been done to the financial base of our universities during the pandemic recession. So foreign students were such a big source of revenue that's gone, and I said that I hope accidentally the universities were denied the emergency support that other export service industries like casinos got. Crown Casino got 115 million in the first 4 months of JobKeeper because its export revenues had fallen with high rollers from Asia no longer able to come. Well, the universities had a similar decline in their service exports but didn't qualify for JobKeeper. I said I hope that's accidental, and if it's accidental it will be quickly corrected in one way or another. If it's not corrected, then the fracturing of the financial base of the university will be a major impediment to growth of exports in the period ahead. But anyway, however you look at it, the exports face quite big headwinds at the moment, and we're not going to get back to sustainable growth unless export growth is at least as rapid as the economy. And so where will we get the growth from? And the answer is from taking advantage of our low carbon opportunity, the types of opportunities that I pointed out in the book, Superpower. And the opportunity there has expanded since I published Superpower at the end of 2019 because the rest of the developed world and China have strongly embraced the objective of zero emissions. The zero emissions objective is absolutely crucial because the way the atmospheric physics work, temperatures, trend temperatures, of course there's going to be fluctuations year by year, but average temperatures, trend temperatures are going to keep rising while carbon emissions are positive. If we reduce emissions by half, we will slow down the rate of increase, but the temperatures will still be increasing. It's only when we get to zero net emissions that the warming trends will stop. And we've seen enough in the last couple of years in Australia and elsewhere of the disruptive consequences of rising temperatures for the world to start to take very seriously right through political systems the challenge of dealing with climate change. And we've had quite strong commitments to zero emissions by 2050 for some time in Europe and the UK, the European Union, the UK, and the smaller European countries that are not members of the EU. During 2020, some very important new commitments were made. Japan and Korea committed themselves to zero emissions by 2050. Canada and New Zealand did. The US, like Australia, was an outlier, standing outside the global commitment until the defeat of Mr. Trump and the election of President Biden. But the election result in the United States, first the presidential election, and then the outcome in the Senate with the repeat elections in Georgia, giving the Democrats a majority in the Senate, means that the US is now as strongly committed to early progress towards zero emissions as the other developed countries. And President Biden has made it clear not only that under his leadership the US will make concerted and rapid progress towards zero emissions by 2050, but it's going to be a major feature of US foreign policy, that the US will make sure the rest of the world does it as well. Prior to the US election making that very big change, China, the Chinese president, in a electronic meeting of the United Nations General Assembly in September, committed China to zero emissions by 2060. So of all the developed countries of the world, plus China, the one country that's not now committed to zero emissions sometime around the middle of the century is Australia. And that's not actually a viable position. It's not viable for Australia to have a tense relationship with China and to tell the President of the United States that we oppose his most important domestic and international policy objectives. It's just not sustainable. And if it's not sustainable, it won't be sustained. The question is whether we will shuffle sideways like a crab on the bottom of the ocean towards zero emissions commitments, or whether we'll embrace the objective and really gear our economy to take advantage of the huge opportunities that we have in that world. And this shift of the rest of the world over the last year, something that certainly I did not expect when COVID broke. I thought it quite likely that the concern for the pandemic itself and for the recessionary impact of the pandemic would divert attention from dealing with climate change. It would actually put back progress on climate change. It's really interesting that the opposite has happened. We've had these stronger and new commitments from Japan and Korea and China. But most important of all, COVID destroyed the Trump presidency, and we now have a US president very strongly committed, more strongly committed than any previous president has been, and not only to the US going to zero emissions, but making sure the rest of the world does as well. Now, not all Australians yet recognise it, but that is huge opportunity. That makes it possible for us to restore full employment and have incomes growth through the 2020s. Those very big headwinds would block us if it was not for this opportunity, and making use of that opportunity becomes crucial to our economic prospects as we come out of the pandemic recession. One strong point I make in the book is that it is not enough for Australians to aspire to get back to where we were before the pandemic economically. The 7 years before the pandemic, 2013 to 2019, after we stopped getting boosts in incomes from the China resources boom that ended 2012, 2013, after that, our economic performance was actually very poor. Average output per person in Australia was right at the bottom of the developed countries. Average output per person in those 7 years hardly increased at all. Our performance there on this most important of economic indicators was slower, was worse than Japan, and lots of Australians are used to thinking of Japan as a bit of an economic growth basket case. Well, if you think Japan was a basket case, then we were worse. We didn't actually experience a recession. Total economic growth kept growing through that period, but entirely the result of our very strong population growth through immigration being unusually high during that period. So growth in output and incomes per person wasn't increasing. The overall economy was growing through immigration. That was not beneficial to the average living standards of Australians. And that's a very big reason why we should not want to go back to that period that I refer to as the dog days. Dog days is the name I gave what I feared was coming when I published that book called Dog Days, Australia After the Boom in 2013. Unfortunately, we didn't make the changes that could have avoided those outcomes, and we lived through the dog days. Another illustration of why it's not good enough to go back to 2013-19 is that we made almost no progress in reducing unemployment from substantial levels at the beginning of the period to the end, about 5.5% unemployment in 2013, about the same in 2019. That contrasts with other developed countries that made quite a lot of progress in reducing unemployment that period. I got a chart in the book comparing what happened to our unemployment with that in the United States. They had a much worse global financial crisis than us. Unemployment went over 10.5%. By 2013, it was still several percentage points higher than us. But by 2019, their unemployment had fallen from several percent higher than our 5.5%, right down to 3.5%, but we were still stuck at 5.5%. And while unemployment was stuck, underemployment, people not being able to work as many hours as they wanted to, rose very strongly through that period. So we've got to do better than that. The book's about how we could have genuine full employment, I say by about 2025. What is genuine full employment? It's the lowest rate of unemployment that's consistent with avoiding accelerating inflation. How low is that? It's much lower than we've been thinking about as being attainable. The US got down to 3.5% before the recession without facing inflationary pressures. I can't see any reason why Australia couldn't get that low. Anyway, we should be aiming to get that low or lower and continuing to improve competitiveness and increase domestic demand to achieve full employment until the emergence of inflationary pressures in the labour market, rising wages in the market, tell us that we've reached full employment. So the story is a story of very big challenges facing us, but extraordinary opportunity, and the extraordinary opportunity is the richer because during the pandemic, the world, now led by the United States, has committed itself to zero emissions around the middle of the century. And if we embrace that as our future, we can do very well in that world. Australia will do very well. It's actually a very good world for South Australia. South Australia had disadvantages compared with the eastern states in the fossil energy economy. South Australia doesn't have the rich coal resources that Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria has. That was always a disadvantage. It made South Australian power prices to industry more expensive than in other countries. That was always the case. Go back right to the beginning of the national electricity market. Well, in the zero emissions world where renewable energy is very important, that is all reversed. South Australia's got advantages, and in the last 18 months, for the first time in the life of the national electricity market, South Australian wholesale power prices, the power prices available to industry, are lower than those in Victoria and New South Wales. So embrace the new opportunities. It's great for Australia, and it's especially great for South Australia. Thank you.
Ross, that was fantastic. Can I ask you an easy question to start off with, maybe? Was it a little nerve-wracking putting out a book on the recovery from the pandemic recession where we're still in the pandemic?
I'm too old to be nerve-wracked, but it did require a lot of work because updating the charts and tables. And I gave 6 public lectures. My wife Jane and I got very good friends in the medical faculty and the Doherty Research Centre at the University of Melbourne. We were talking to them in the middle of March, and they were telling us about COVID, saying how bad is it going to be. And they said, really bad. We're going to be shut down. How long might we shut down for? Well, it might be a long time. How long? Oh, it might be most of the winter. So Jane and I took ourselves to the very middle of Queensland, to a tiny little town of Barcaldine in the west of Queensland, and we didn't come back till December. So from Barcaldine, I gave 6 public lectures in May and June, and it's really the bones of the book, those 6 public lectures. And I promised in the last lecture that I'd have a book out in November, but as the year proceeded, first I had to update all the numbers. You can manage that, they come out every month, but what I couldn't do was anticipate the result of the US election, how the book was going to end.
You didn't even know the ending to your own story.
Depended so much on what happened in the United States. That was a real knife-edge decision. If it had fallen the other way, I actually would be quite pessimistic, not only about the world's chances of dealing with climate change, but about the Australian economy and its prospects in getting out of the pandemic recession. So I talked to the publisher and we agreed that I would wait until after we knew what had happened in the US before finishing it off. And so I got to work after the first Tuesday in November, and although even then we didn't know for a while who was actually going to occupy the White House, but at least the presumption was strong enough for me to write the story.
So while you were in Barcaldine, is there an actual tree of knowledge?
Yes, there is, yeah.
Tell me the story of the tree of knowledge.
In 1891, I don't know if Australians learn Australian history anymore. The price of wool was falling in 1891. The men who owned the acres said something must be done. We'll break the shearers' union. We'll show where the masters still. They'll take the pay we give them, or we'll find the men who will. From Claremont to Barcaldine rang out the shearers' call. The sheds will be sure union, or they won't be sure at all. Well,
that is not what I expected.
So you had the great shearers' strike of 1891. The strike was broken by the Queensland police, and the workers, mainly shearers and carriers, work in the transport industry in very difficult conditions, they had a huge camp in Barcaldine. They used to meet under a great big ghost gum that they called the Tree of Knowledge to work out what they would do. And Henry Lawson wrote a famous poem in the Bulletin at that time, speculating about whether the blood would stain the wattle, whether this would be revolutionary for Australia. And the workers meeting under the Tree of Knowledge decided to form a political party and to seek to change the laws rather than to respond violently. I say in the first chapter of the book, The Tree of Knowledge, that it's a triumph of Australian history that we mark a decisive moment by reference to a tree of knowledge and not to a battle of Yorktown or Gettysburg. Yeah.
So look, we took a little meander through that poem and that fantastic story because knowledge kind of underlies most of the book, the importance of knowledge. I'm just going to quote you to yourself, mostly for the benefit of the people here. Great political leaders absorb knowledge from the experts, including knowledge of what we do not know. They use that knowledge to build policies that give the country the best chance of coming into a position that most people think is good. They explain the reasons for the choices in ways that give confidence that the sacrifices are worth the effort. They acknowledge uncertainty, project confidence that the best path has been chosen. How are we going?
I say in the book, we haven't made up our mind. I think the initial response to recession, well, first, we did use knowledge in our response to the pandemic recession, big tick for Australia. And in this, we were different from the United States and the United Kingdom. And because our leaders, federal and state, respected knowledge, we were able to deal with the problem. And while we've had outbreaks, the health problem and the economic problem is nowhere near as severe as in the countries that did not respect knowledge. So on that, good. On use of economic knowledge to shape policies for recession, again, a tick for the first stage for the various measures that were announced last March. And the government was open to good advice from a very good Secretary for the Treasury, who happened to be the head of the Secretariat for my second climate change review. But the government was open to good economic advice in shaping that initial response. What matters now, that gave us a good 2020, gave us that strong that put a floor under unemployment in the second half of the year, when otherwise it would have kept falling down. But whether we get to full employment and rising income through the 2020s depends on what we do next. And I think we haven't made up our minds about how much we'll respect knowledge in that. Neither have we at a Commonwealth level made up our mind about whether we'll respect atmospheric physics knowledge related to the climate. Now, Australia as a whole, I think, has. All 6 state governments and the 2 territory governments, whether it's Liberal or Labor, have actually responded to the scientific knowledge and shaped approaches to climate and energy that's consistent with scientific knowledge. The states can go quite a long way on their own, and I make the point in the book that we can get a fair way with good performance from the states, if necessary for years, if necessary alone, but it would be better and we'd go faster and do a better job if we had the Commonwealth supporting the states in that area. This, I hope, is an open question in the period ahead. I think that we will be under a lot of pressure from other countries, and the pressure that Australian governments feel the most, of course, is the pressure from Washington. In the Australian community, there is now a very wide respect for scientific knowledge about climate change. I think there's a community base for our Commonwealth government to shift position and support what the states are doing. We'll have to wait and see whether they do respect knowledge enough to make the change.
So, in terms of that respect for knowledge, do you really think it was accidental that universities got left out of the emergency funding?
I hope it was accidental.
We'll hope it was accidental. I get the feeling you're fairly optimistic overall, which actually brings me to the idea of full employment. With all the various factors in there, what is going to happen, do you think, with population growth? Because one of the things you didn't mention just now is, of course, our dwindling birth rate. So now that we've got the full stop on immigration and we're not clear what's going to happen there.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm critical of what happened to immigration policy in the dog days. It became very voluminous. We were adding an average of a percentage point per annum to population. That's very high. The only times we've had increases like that after the gold rushes of during the gold rush of the 19th century, and for a while immediately after the Second World War, the Southern European migration, but then we eased back, and through the years of very strong economic performance in Australia, the 1990s, which was our strongest period of productivity growth, especially compared with the rest of the world we'd ever had, we were adding about 0.5% to our national population each year from immigration. Well, that's quite a lot. It's much higher than any other developed country except Israel and Canada. But then we doubled that in the period leading up to the pandemic recession. I'm suggesting in the book that immigration's fallen to zero, slightly less than zero last year, that we should decide in advance to head back towards a moderate level of immigration, about 0.5% per annum. I think it'll be very controversial if governments seek to take it right back to the very high levels that we had before. But I'm even more critical of the composition of immigration during what happened in, well, really for the first 20 years of the 20th century. The post-war immigration, and I suppose only old people like me still use terms like post-war, but after the Second World War was premised on migrants being on a path to being Australian citizens. And so the expectation was that migrants would become Australian citizens. They were treated as Australians. We called them new Australians, and treated as Australians from the time that they arrived. And we put quite a lot of investment into preparing migrants for full life in our society, teaching English as a second language and so on, big investments in that. And from the beginning, migrants felt that they were fully committed as Australians to being part of our society, joined Australian institutions. Well, the big change in the 21st century is that for the first time, the phenomenon of temporary migration became important. A very high proportion of migrants weren't here on a path to citizenship, and they didn't have, first of all, didn't have the commitments to Australia because they weren't on a path to being Australians, and they weren't confident of their rights as Australians. And so we had the emergence of large-scale exploitation of migrant workers in the workplace. Temporary migrants who felt that they would lose their rights to be here if they insisted on normal Australian legal rights in the workplace. And I think that was quite important in undermining wages growth in the first couple of decades, and more so over time through the 21st century. So I'm suggesting that we go back to emphasising permanent migration rather than temporary migration as the main avenue of access to Australia.
I think it's been really interesting recently seeing farmers warn about fruit rotting on the vines because they've got so used to being able to exploit imported labour.
And Australian employers, including in the bush, have become unused to training Australians and making the workplace attractive for Australians. Now, we'd help getting Australians into that sort of job even more with one of my other recommendations I didn't have time to recommend.
Are you going to skip straight to, you're going to skip straight to the Australian income security, are you?
Yeah.
You can do that. But this is, I mean, it's probably garnered the most headlines, I suppose, out of your book. So could I at least ask a question first instead of you just taking control because, you know, I need to keep the job? I've been surprised, having only sort of heard about the idea of a universal basic income relatively recently, thinking it was a fairly fringe idea, to very quickly coming to realise how very seriously it's being taken. And yours is obviously the most detailed scheme that I've had a look at. So just go ahead, tell us all about it.
Yeah. Well, I make the point in the book that we're only going to be able to recreate a successful economy, and there's lots of change associated with that, a decline in some industries, expansion of others. If it's broadly accepted and understood through the community that the overall changes are fair, that all Australians are being looked after, and And that's how I get into the issue of reforming personal income taxation and social security around the idea of a universal basic income. Now, the idea is that you integrate the social security system and the tax system into one system, that all citizens, except those on quite high incomes or with quite high wealth,
Can you give us a number there at the cut?
Yeah, I'm suggesting $250,000 for income and a couple of $1 million for net wealth, which if you own a good house in Sydney might not seem a lot, but in the rest of Australia...
In Adelaide, you're all right.
It's all right. And that most Australians would receive a fortnightly payment, and I suggest equal to the unemployment benefit rate. It was 10% lower when I wrote the book than it will be as a result of the decision that's just been made. And then you tax all income from the first dollar at a moderate rate, and I talk about the pros and cons of that moderate rate being 37% or the 32.5%, which, following the last budget, after my Barcaldine lectures, the Treasurer's made the rate at which most Australian incomes are taxed. So you wouldn't have a tax-free threshold. You'd pay income on your first dollar. It'd be a very simple system. If you lost your job, you'd still get you wouldn't be applying for unemployment benefits. You'd still be getting the basic payment. It's very helpful to economic efficiency once you've got full employment. Our whole goal is to get full employment because if you move from unemployment and unemployment benefits or other social security payments into employment, you don't lose quickly most or all of the income through withdrawal of the social security payment. The combination of withdrawal of social security payments and taxation mean that once people on social security get beyond a rather modest level of income, they can be losing most, in some cases all, in some cases even more than all, of incremental income. So it's quite a big disincentive for full participation in the labour force. And I suggest that we could expand our labour force by a few percent if we embrace that idea, remove the disincentives to employment associated with the current social security and tax system. It's administratively simpler. It means that Centrelink's job wouldn't be to check whether people had looked hard enough for non-existent jobs. It would actually be
chasing robo-debts.
Would actually be to help them find a job. And I think that it would have very important effects on incentives for employment, but it also become a supplement for people on low incomes. That's the way the arithmetic works out. So getting someone from Melbourne to work on the Murray River picking pears, the incomes are relatively low. They're set very low because that's all that's necessary to attract these temporary migrants from many parts of the world, which now are our main rural unskilled labour force, but it would assist in increasing incentives for Australians to take that sort of employment. And Australians used to be happy to take those low-skill rural jobs. I think that Australians would respond again to incentives if we made it worthwhile for them.
Having picked pears, you'd have to pay me quite a lot to start on that. And the other point I really like...
You might be able to do something else.
Yeah. Oh, but my industry's going so well. One of the other points I really like that you made is that also with that level of security for some people, they might turn their hands to entrepreneurial pursuits, to innovation. And you said, and I'm going to get this stat wrong because I hadn't actually written it down here, something like you only need 1 in 100 of those innovations to take off, and there you have another expansion of the economy again.
Yeah, I think the interaction, the combined effects of my suggested reform of corporate income tax and the movement to the Australian income security will be quite a powerful incentive for, especially for young people, and it's young people who do the most important innovation in our society, start new businesses and build them up. The combination of those two things would provide good support for people taking a risk, having a go, starting a band or a restaurant or trying to make go a farm that was right at the margins to begin with, but with effort might become better. I think it'd be very helpful for promoting the entrepreneurial activity that we can do with more of.
So they could start a farm, hire a whole bunch of people and pay them properly, and then we'd have a bit of a win-win.
Yeah.
All right, so I've got a few questions from the audience here that have been pre-sent in. Sorry, COVID things, it got a little bit difficult with having people shout or microphones. What do you think are the chances of some Australian Conservatives overcoming their traditional economics? And I'm just going to add, obviously, in COVID we saw a swift and surprising shift in the attitude to spending, and then we had talk of a snapback. Yeah, so what do you think the chances are that there will be a shift towards a more fair and equitable system?
I think that depends a fair bit on us. We are a democracy. The great advantage of a democracy is that what citizens are talking about and advocating can have some influence. And I think we can go too far in just expecting our leaders to pull the ideas we need out of their own brains and out of their own interaction in Parliament House. We've got to develop support for the right sorts of programs. So let's not blame the people in Canberra. We can get quite a long way in showing that there's genuine community support for getting rid of the complacency that's been leading to Australian underperformance. We require Australia to do better, and they've got to be part of it. When you talk about Australian Conservatives standing in the way of some of the sorts of changes we've talked about, just with climate change, there's usually a very strong focus, for example, on the coal areas of Queensland. I've just spent 9 months there. They're not very different from the lovely people of Adelaide in attitudes to a very wide range of things.
Bob Catter's a bit different.
Well, not as different as you might hope. My contact with that part of Queensland began when the seven mayors of the western regions of Queensland made contact with me and said, we've seen you saying that we've got this wonderful renewable energy resources. What we need is jobs. We haven't had any new jobs for 2 generations. All of our kids and grandkids, as soon as they leave school, they're off to Brisbane or Sydney, because that's the only place where a job is. And can you help us think about how we can turn this resource into a job? So and they said, we've got above our heads what you say is Eastern Australia's best renewable energy resource. We've got below our feet the world's best coal resource, and the only new job anyone's offered us for 30 years has been jobs digging up the stuff beneath our feet. We would love to have sustainable jobs, but if the only jobs are unsustainable, we'll take them rather than nothing. And so I think for those regions, and let's be honest about it. These changes, while they're beneficial for Australians as a whole, do put a big burden of adjustment on people working in the old industries, and we've got to provide alternatives to them, and we can. And if we do that, do what we should be doing as a society, they'll be as happy about the journey as we are.
Now, this question, it was actually really remiss of me not to ask it earlier. How much would the income be set at, the basic income?
Well, I suggested at the unemployment rate, and the unemployment rate, the decision's been taken to raise it by 10%. So
it shuffles with whatever or keeps pace with whatever the government's then doing.
Yeah. And this might seem too low, and no one thinks that the unemployment benefit allows a prosperous life, and it doesn't give a reasonable living standard. But this is in the context of strong commitment to full employment. So everyone who wants a job has got a job, and this becomes what tides you over in the short periods between jobs at a time of full employment. Which we don't have now, which we haven't had for 50 years, 48 years, and also it becomes a supplement for people on low incomes, where the 32.5% or 37% that's being taken out in tax leaves them with as much, which when topped up with the unemployment benefit gives a reasonable income. So I think the adequacy of that basic payment in conditions of full employment points to something very, very different, as if you've got an unemployment benefit in the current circumstances.
We've just got time for one more. It's kind of a cracker. Are we too late to stop global climate change catastrophe? I'm not sure that's the best question to finish on, but it seemed to come up quite a bit.
Well, my answer is probably a good point to end it on. The answer is no. Now, it would have been better to have dealt with it 30 years ago. The climate change we've already had, a global increase in temperatures over ocean and land, a bit over 1 degree. Well, we've already seen disruption of that. Bushfires in Australia and California, the warming and drying of southern Australia, the reduction in average rainfall in the Adelaide area, even greater in my hometown of Perth in the southwest of West Australia. The first big effects of climate change have been felt in these Mediterranean climates, and it's the same all over the world. Spain and Italy and Morocco, in the southwest, South Africa, Central California, the San Francisco area, the Chile coast in South America, on all these west-facing coasts in those latitudes, the latitudes we're in now in Adelaide have been very severely affected, and that's forced the people of Perth, for example, to rely almost entirely on desalination now, and they're carrying the costs of that. So it would have been better not to have this 1.1%, and the 1.1% average increase all over the world in temperature is a bit misleading, because that's the average over land and sea, and the sea warms up much less rapidly than land, so land's warming more than that, but that's given us a lot of big problems. But the problems will be very much greater if we let it go beyond 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and it's not too late to hold it. It's too late to turn it back from the 1.1 we've had to 0, but it's not too late to stop us getting, certainly not too late to get to 2 degrees. If the world gets to 0 emissions by 2050, then there's a reasonable chance of holding temperature to 2 degrees. We could actually do much better than that and do quite well economically out of doing better than that. But that would mean we'd have to get to 0 emissions before 2050. I think that the way the world's going, with the sort of leadership on this issue we're now seeing from the developed countries of the world and from China, all led by the United States, we may very well see that as we're making progress, the pressures emerged for more rapid progress. So I don't think 1.5 degrees is out of the question. So it's too late to avoid all problems. It's not too late to avoid catastrophic outcomes.
Phew. Ross, thank you so much. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I think I got through less than a tenth of the questions that I had here in front of me. So everyone just go buy the book, and hopefully all the answers will be in there. I'm sure they will.
Right.